Hello. Hard to beat robots, but try. Yeah, so here you go. Talking about system parachains here, just a quick outline, starting off with like an intro to system parachains, and then if some of you have been around for a while, we've renamed a lot of stuff like common good to system parachain and statement to asset hub. So I'm going to discuss a little bit why we're making these name changes and hopefully how to make better name decisions in the future. And then just run through a bunch of the current projects that we're working on, which is actually quite a few. So yeah, objectives. I had a really short amount of time because I was on vacation. And then I had 1 week between vacation and this event to actually prepare. So I asked ChatGPT to make it for me. But it actually did not a terrible job. So this is kind of like, why do we have system parachains? If you just go back to like kind of the first principles of Polkadot, like what's the core problem that Polkadot is trying to solve? The problem is if you have a single blockchain and you have too many transactions or applications that are trying to use it, they end up competing for the block space within that blockchain, and they can basically disrupt each other, right? If one application is getting a lot of use, it can cause the transaction fees on another application to spike. And so how do you go about scaling that? And of course, there's a bunch of different approaches. You can try to make that single blockchain super fast. You can go to layer 2. You can bridge to other networks, right? And what Polkadot did was we said, okay, well, the way to go about solving this problem is to split up these applications into blockchains that are specific to those applications. And so, of course, a big part of that is for people who want to deploy applications and not actually like the core protocol developers. So maybe in like Ethereum, this would be like smart contract developers. They just come, they want to deploy their application on Ethereum. You make a smart contract. On Polkadot, you want to develop an application, you create a parachain. But this approach to scaling doesn't only apply to those applications. It also applies to the core protocol itself. What if you have a lot of staking and governance and auction transactions? How do you go about scaling the use of the core Polkadot protocol? Well, parachains. It's the same answer. So the goal of system parachains is just to move this functionality into parachains. It's purely architectural. And that's it. And I think there's this misconception that there's like this finite number of parachain slots available. And if you have a system parachain, that's just actually taking up a slot that an application could use. And if you actually look at like the reason that the Polkadot like scaling thesis works is that when you have a transaction on the relay chain, every validator has to validate it. So on Polkadot, that's like 300 validators have to validate this transaction. If you have a transaction on a parachain, it's validated by first 5 validators and then a few others, and then double check it to make sure that they did it correctly. So maybe like 20 validators are actually looking at this transaction. So if you take that from 300 down to 5, and hopefully, or 300 down to 20, and hopefully eventually like 1,000 validators down to 20 that have to actually process this transaction, that frees up a lot of CPU and network time for those validators to process other things like validating other parachains. So the goal of this is to actually make the pie bigger so that instead of supporting, say, 200 parachain cores, Polkadot could support 300 or 400. So this actually makes adding more parachains possible. It's not taking like an arbitrarily fixed or limited number of slots. I asked AI to make the rest of my presentation, but it's good at being polite, but not making slides, apparently. So how do we want this to feel? Because I think there's been probably a lot of pain if you've gone about trying to use any of these parachains, that you have to know, okay, I need to go to statement. I need to go to the collectives parachain to do this thing. I need to go to the relay chain to do this thing. I need to I wanted to create an asset on statement or the asset hub, but all my dot was on the relay chain. Now I have to go to the relay chain and teleport it and go back to the asset hub, and it's a huge pain. And this is all UX stuff. So one thing that I want to emphasize is like more like the tooling and user experience layer is that we really want Polkadot to have to feel like one network, and that users shouldn't need to know the architecture or where this functionality lives, it should all be handled by middleware. Ideally, even user experience developers don't need to see it, right? Like, how do you take architecture away from the user, take it away from the user experience developers? So there's a lot of I think there's like some good ideas for middleware, for example, that would completely take this out, because like even a UX developer, they don't want to put in a list of like 20 WebSockets that they have to connect to in order for a user to use applications or to develop their front-end application. They want to connect to a single API. So I don't know if this exists yet. I've heard of a couple people who are making stuff similar to this. But if you kind of think about like a single middleware API, where you could say like, okay, I want to get my address rendering information from Kilt and Litentry, or you can kind of put in this, and this middleware would actually connect to all the parachains, and actually ideally it wouldn't even connect to public RPC nodes. It would be running light clients internally. And it would just be able to serve that information through a single API. So even for like user experience or like front-end developers, it would feel like they're just interacting with a single network and not have to know about all these different parachains. And the reason I put the Netflix logo up there is just as an example of like an application that you use. You might be watching one series and then decide to switch to another series. Netflix doesn't tell you, okay, right now you're in the Frankfurt data center, you have to connect to the London data center to watch that series. That would be ridiculous, right? It's one application, even though it might be serving data from multiple different points. On Polkadot, even though a single application might be split across multiple different parachains, I think the Polkadot fellows kind of feel this pain right now, that the OpenGov referenda are on the relay chain, but the fellowship referenda are on the collectives parachain, and they have to kind of know which one to go in and transact on in order to use this like application that we might call governance, right? So a good wallet or a good user experience would abstract all of that away, and you would only just say like, okay, like I want to vote, and it would know, okay, well you're a fellow and you're voting in the fellowship referendum, so we're going to route your transaction on this chain, or this is like the public referendum needs to go to this other chain. I put a link to something on the forum because I think somebody asked, I wrote a little bit about what I just said. Somebody asked a question that I think was really, really well intended, like why don't you make more UIs for the system parachains? And I wrote a little bit about what I just said here, that like UI should be focused on applications, not the underlying architecture. Okay, so naming things. Whatever happened to the term common good? I've tried to kind of kill the usage of this term, at least as it applies to parachains. I think this was kind of a mistake that I made when we started naming these like 2 years ago. A lot of the ideas that went behind the idea of common good parachain came from this Stanford, I don't know if it's an article, it's like an encyclopedia entry almost. But some of the core things were like, especially that common goods are relationship-based and non-aggregative. So it doesn't mean that like it's better for everybody. So like a library, it might be worse for the bookstore, but it's still around this like the community has an idea, has a thesis or like a core value that knowledge should be accessible to everybody for free. And so that's why you might still have a library, even though it hurts the bookstore. And the other part is that it's relationship-based, or they are relationship-based. And so you can't just say like, oh, this is a common good. It requires buy-in from the people that you're in relationships with. So I was always really careful, like when writing about this, to say like, okay, well, we're building this parachain, and like I plan to propose it to the network that it should be a common good. I don't think it has really been used that way so much within Polkadot. I see a lot of proposals that's like, well, we're building this thing and like it's generally useful, so it's a common good. I think it could be true, but the thing that makes it a common good is actually that it passes a referendum, that people accept it, that like we want to fund this, like we think this is infrastructure that people should use. So with system parachains, I think it's particularly easy to kind of drop this term just because the Polkadot system is actually on-chain, right? Like this is kind of going a little bit off topic, but Polkadot hosts its own logic. Like the runtime itself is hosted in the network. So if some functionality is in the network that has been approved via the root origin, via governance, and a runtime upgrade, it's just part of the Polkadot system. So stuff that's in System Parachains, it's just part of the Polkadot system, and this goes back to like this idea of a singular network. Like if it's in a System Parachain, it's part of the Polkadot system. I think this common good term can actually still apply to a lot of things, like especially infrastructure and tooling, where you can't really like deterministically say like it's not in the runtime that like this block explorer is part of the Polkadot system, but there could be like some consensus that the treasury funds a block explorer to provide services for every parachain that is connected, and you could argue like, well, okay, like this is a common good, like there's a relationship with the stakeholders in the network. So yeah, I guess I just said what's on the next slide. That we wanted to emphasize that Polkadot is a single system, and that wherever some functionality lives, whether it's in a smart contract or a parachain or in the relay chain, this is just architectural. It should all be under the hood to the user. They shouldn't see anything like this. So the asset hub, right? So this was part of the general like System Parachains rename. When we first had this idea of System Parachains, like there was some functionality that was new, and we thought like, okay, well, we might want to like brand this a little bit, but I've kind of gone back to the opinion that like this should be like more neutral, and that we shouldn't really be promoting like something like Statement as a brand. So I wanted to emphasize like the core utility of these chains, and also just the neutrality. And the naming got a little bit out of hand. I mean, we started with Statement for Polkadot, and this was like kind of cool. And then it was like, well, what are we going to call the Kusama one? State mine. The mine where you get the raw materials, and then the mint where you make them nice and shiny. But then, and then we ended up with like West Mint and Rock Mine and Woke Mint, and it got a little bit too much to handle. Nobody knew what any of these chains were. So now it's going to be nice and simple. Just take a relay chain name and asset hub. So Polkadot asset hub, Kusama asset hub. Hopefully much simpler. I think this is like, by and large, the least controversial thing I've ever proposed. I threw out this idea, and everybody was like, yes, please, as soon as possible. OK, so now I'm kind of moving on to like this next section of some of our projects and team goals. So increasing the number of parachains. I kind of took this screenshot from PokeAssembly. This was like 2 years ago when we made the first proposal for Polkadot auctions on Polkadot. And one of the ideas like was Polkadot is supposed to have some, like say, quality of service guarantee. If you have a parachain on Polkadot, it should never stall. The block time should never get any slower. It should never have any kind of like service degradation. And one of the ways to go about that was by pushing Kusama to the limit and always keeping Polkadot a little bit more conservative. So Kusama would always have more validators, more parachain validators, more parachains. And we tried to push Kusama and say, OK, if we keep Polkadot within some limit, then we have a reasonable guarantee that this quality of service will be upheld. But we've kind of run into this problem lately where, of course, the slot leases on Kusama expire faster, so there's a little bit higher turnover, and people want more parachains on Polkadot. And so we don't want to artificially say, like, well, we can't have any more parachains on Polkadot because there aren't enough parachains on Kusama. So how do we go about fixing that? Well, we can simulate them. So we have this idea of a Glutton Parachain. And the idea is to test the stability of the network under a lot of load. So another problem we have, even if we have, like, say, 100 parachains on Kusama, what if nobody is using them, right? So in the parachain validation, the parachain has to pass this blob of data called the proof of validity. And there are generally two limiting factors in how you go about executing this. One is, of course, the time that it takes to execute all the transactions that are in this proof. And the other is the size. How many bytes is this blob? Because the validators have to take this and split it up. They have to send it to other validators in the network. And so, of course, the bigger it is, the more network bandwidth it takes up. And so even if you have a bunch of parachains, if they're not getting really heavy use, it might not be simulating what really heavy use on Polkadot is. So if you have 100 parachains on Kusama and 80 parachains on Polkadot, but they're being used really heavily, you might not get that guarantee that just because Kusama has more, that you're still going to get the same kind of stability and performance on Polkadot. So with Gluttons, we basically simulate a parachain that's under full load. It starts out by it just starts hashing a bunch of random data, writing all this data into the proof of validity, filling up its maximum size, and then it uses whatever time is left over to just run through some CPU cycles and do some like hash some random data until it runs out of time, and it submits this full blob to the relay chain validators to distribute and handle. And this is not really something I think like any end user or even Parachain team would really end up seeing. It's more for like Robert K's team and the Parachain core consensus team. So they've deployed a couple of them on the testnet Versi, and then hopefully we can deploy some on Kusama. And we can just actually like replicate it. Just take the same runtime and put 100 of these on hopefully eventually Kusama, but I think that might be a while. And then we can say, okay, if Kusama works with these like fully loaded parachains, then we know that with a little bit fewer, Polkadot will definitely work. So yeah, moving on. Foreign assets. So this is mostly around Asset Hub. And we really want Asset Hub to be able to hold any asset that is accessible within the Polkadot network. So instead of identifying assets by a U32, which they are in the main instance of the assets palette, which is an integer like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we identify them by a multi-location. So this is a lot more expressive. And the asset ID actually expresses like kind of its home. So I put a few examples here, like it might be kind of small to read, but like the first one is a Parachain native asset. So you have here a Parachain 9000. The actual asset ID would be parents 1. So from Asset Hub's perspective, this says go up 1 level to the relay chain. And then the interior would say go to Parachain 9000. And this would be the native token of Parachain 9000. But it doesn't just stop at 1 level, like for Parachains. You can go down multiple levels. So Parachain 9000, it might have an instance of the assets palette itself that people have minted assets into. So you could actually say go up 1 parent, and then go to Parachain 9000, palette instance 50, and then an index 42 for an asset ID on that parachain. And then even bridged assets. So if you want to have KSM on Polkadot, you could say parents 2. So this is a little bit funny because you think, okay, well, I go up 1, this is the relay chain. What's above the relay chain? Nothing. It's just kind of this like fuzzy universal area that we've dubbed global consensus. So once you go up to like parents 2, you say, well, where do I want to go now? Okay, well, I want to go to Kusama. That's the native asset of Kusama, of course, KSM. So you can actually take any assets and ETH as well. So like if you have like the bridge to Ethereum, we can take ETH, parents 2, global consensus, Ethereum. This makes Asset Hub able to represent any asset that you can reach from Polkadot. So this would be like a single point, say for like a custodian. You could send these assets anywhere, right? So like if a user has an asset and they want to have it on a parachain, they don't have to go through Asset Hub. This is kind of a problem now, like when a user wants to withdraw something from an exchange and they want to like bring it to a parachain, especially like an EVM parachain like Moonbeam, where the user might be using MetaMask, and this doesn't work on Asset Hub. And you say like, well, first withdraw this to Asset Hub, and then you have to set up your Polkadot.js wallet, and then you have to send it to Moonbeam. This is a user experience disaster. So we can actually just put all of this functionality into Asset Hub itself. So a user can ask the exchange, I want this asset, and I want it on this address on this chain. And it can just be routed there directly. And the user actually never even has to see Asset Hub. They don't even need to know that it exists. It can just go right to whoever the user wants to use this application. And this also expresses a lot more than like a 20 byte hash or an integer when you identify an asset. Because if you have something like, if we look at Ethereum, for example, you have, anybody can just take the metadata of their ERC20 token and call it USDT. And so you have to have this kind of like social consensus that, this is the contract hash that corresponds to USDT, and all the other people who call themselves that, they're not real, right? But there are also assets on Ethereum that are ERC20 tokens, but they're controlled by some protocol, like in a smart contract. And you have no way to differentiate those two just by looking at the contract address of that asset. Where here, in Asset Hub, you can look at something and say, well, this is asset ID 42. We know that this is controlled by some address. Somebody, it could, of course, be like a proxy or multi-sig, but if you trace this down far enough, there is some person with a private key who's actually like administering the issuance and management of this asset. But if you look at something that says, this is a multi-location and it's Parachain 9000, you know this asset is not governed by just a person with a private key. This is governed by a protocol, whatever has the governance privilege of Parachain 9000. So this is very new. It's been on Kusama for I think like 2 or 3 months, and it's going to be on Polkadot in about 2 weeks. I don't think any parachains on Kusama have actually registered their asset in Asset Hub yet. So I don't know, maybe somebody can win this race. But I think once we build some more tooling around it, this is going to be really powerful, especially for like infrastructure providers. They don't have to support, they don't have to run nodes for every parachain in the network. They can just support Asset Hub, and they can still transact with any asset and support users on any chain. Asset conversion. So this is like the simple swap functionality we've been discussing for a little while. So the primary purpose of this is that users can pay fees in any asset. We've had to be pretty careful about what assets become sufficient, because the asset provider can just mint their own token to buy transaction fees with. And of course, on the collator side, they only want DOT, right? Like they don't want to accept fee payment in 100 different assets, because how do they manage that? And so by having this swap functionality, you can say, as long as you can provide the DOT for the transaction fee to the collator, then you can have your transaction executed, and you can provide any asset into the system and get DOT out of it, then you're fine. It solves the problem for the user, pay your fees in any asset. It solves the problem for the collator, only get DOT. The other cool thing is there's no liquidity incentives itself on Asset Hub, but the LP tokens that come from this protocol are just like any other assets in Asset Hub. There's actually just another instance of the assets palette that supports them. So these can be reserved back transferred to other parachains, just like any other asset. So if there's some parachain that wants to have an incentive program for some pair, they can do that on their parachain and just transfer the LP tokens to their parachain and do whatever kind of incentive program they want there. This is finally almost live. It's a little bit slower than we thought, but as of 2 days ago, it's on West End. So go to West End and you can start playing around with this. NFT 2.0, this is something so this guy Yegor knows way more about it than I do. He pretty much designed and implemented the whole thing and still has a ton more ideas. I'm kind of running out of time, and I'm only like halfway through my slides. I'm going to start going faster. So yeah, these smart attributes is just like this key value pair that you can update. So this might be like metadata that you want to have about like the individual who holds the NFT, and you can permission this. So you can say that like some attributes are updatable by the collection creator, some attributes are updatable by the user, and some attributes are updated by somebody else, say a collective. I have an example of that later. Polkadot has made a nice user interface for this already, so you can already go there and start playing around with it. And there is like a little bit of question like, well, why would you have NFTs on Asset Hub? There's no smart contracts, there's no like games or applications here, so what do you do with them? Well, it's again like a single point where other parachains can interact with this. So you might have like an NFT creator. They don't want to learn how to deploy NFTs on 20 different chains. They want to learn, I have DOT, I want to learn to create my NFT collections, I can do it here. Likewise, you might want to use these in a lot of different places, right? So I think Yegor is talking to some people from other parachain teams like Unique about a standard for how you transfer metadata from an NFT's like origin or like home where it was created to some other chain. So now we can say we can create NFTs in one place, but you want to use them on a Star or Unique or BitCountry in some game. You have a way to get that NFT there and use it wherever the user wants to. Bridge hub, yeah. So it's a hub, it's not a bridge. I expect there to be other bridges in the ecosystem, and some of them are going to be faster. Some of them will be cheaper. That's OK. Applications can decide which assets from which bridges they want to use. And a pretty cool thing is it uses the Asset Hub for asset management. So it doesn't actually store any state. There are no transactions on the Bridge Hub itself, except for some like management stuff like collator selection and these types of things. But when it gets a message from, say, Kusama, hey, this user wants to send KSM to Polkadot, it's actually just going to take that and route that to the asset hub, and it all gets stored there. And same with Snowbridge and moving ETH and ETH assets into Polkadot. OK, technical fellowship. It's on the Polkadot Collectives parachain. The organization is taking over the runtimes from Parity. So they're going to be the ones that are like approving merges into the runtime logic and publishing releases that will be proposed as upgrades. There is like an extension to this that allows some on-chain enforcement of some of the vision document, if you will, like promotion periods, how members get inducted. It also handles salary, so like the members of this collective can be paid a yearly salary. Again, application-based, not chain-based. So like the collective itself is represented on the collective's parachain, but the assets, the application, it might use other chains. It whitelists calls on the relay chain. It pays people salaries from the asset hub. And once the bridge is live, we want to remove this from Kusama, and it will just it will act as the fellowship for Kusama just over the bridge. So in the future, we want to have lots more collectives. So of course, all these palettes, like there isn't like a tech fellowship palette, right? It's I think 5 or 6 palettes. The main one being this ranked collective palette, and it has some other stuff like referendum and like origins. But we can just take these and instantiate a whole new set of them to make a new collective. And of course, you might have like a little thing that like extends each collective. So we have some ideas for collectives coming up here, like moving the Polkadot ambassador program on chain, having a parachain technical fellowship. So this might do things like, some parachains have a problem where they brick their chain and they have to go to governance, and it's really long time. We could give the parachain technical fellowship the ability to unbrick a parachain, and then like a council of parachain experts could decide like, okay, this parachain has bricked their chain. They're not trying to do like a malicious runtime upgrade and replace it with something bad. And it happened for like an understandable or reasonable reason. So we're going to unbrick their chain. And then, yeah, the anti-scam team. OK, multi-asset treasuries. OK, 2 minutes. Right. So focus on multi. I always have trouble naming this because it's like multi-assets treasuries. So right now we just have a single treasury and it holds dot, right? But like we want to change this. So one is to have multiple treasuries and not just a single treasury. So like these collectives might come with a treasury themselves. There would be a treasury associated with the tech fellowship, a treasury associated with the ambassador program. And the treasury that's associated with each fellowship or each collective, it's really just the logic. How do you approve spending proposals, right? But then, of course, the assets that are spent in those proposals can be on multiple chains. So you have like a multi-asset, multi-chain, multiple multi-assets, multi-chain treasuries. And the general idea here is to make spending decisions a lot more granular. Rather than coming to the network with a proposal like, I want to host a local event, in Florida, and they kind of ask everybody, like, I live in Switzerland, I'm an engineer, how should I know if a marketing event in Florida is a good idea or not? I don't know. It allows people to go to a collective that's more suited to like the mandate of administering those things. They have more expertise. And of course, you can always go to OpenGov. If you get rejected, you can kind of appeal to the broader community. But I think this would it would make governance system a lot more accessible to people. They get response from people who are more knowledgeable in what they're trying to propose. And it would also just reduce a lot of the noise and just like massive amount of proposals that come through. Collator selection. OK, I'm down to 30 seconds. So we want unstoppability. Right. The short story is we're making some changes to this. We're going to use a lot more invulnerables selected by governance. But oh boy, that's a grammatical screw up from me. Fewer from Parity. And instead of this like first come first serve model to have a bond, we will just replace this with a simple election. So if there's like 10 slots available and you want to be a collator, you just have to put in the 10th highest bid, and you can become a collator. Future, okay, yeah, moving everything basically into parachains. That's the future. Staking parachain, governance parachain. These require XCM v4, which hopefully is in like a year. And then even dot into parachains, so no more dot on the relay chain, everything into Assets Hub and managed via there. And OK, I'm like 10 seconds over, but I made it.